Okay, I think we should be live now. This is Alexander with Spoken Through Leo. Now I'm here to deliver what I promised, which is the refutation of what I consider one of the worst Protestant and Orthodox arguments. You see it a lot online, especially on Twitter. I've seen it on Facebook as well. I've seen it on YouTube comment sections. It just seems to be kind of like an internet Orthodox and to some certain degree Protestant lore as well. Pre-1066. So 1066, for those of you that don't know, is the date of the Battle of Hastings when the Normans successfully conquered England. And the claim is that prior to 1066, England, the British Isles, Scotland, Ireland, none of these areas were Catholic, and that the Catholicity and papal supremacy and all these other things were imposed by the Normans, which obviously doesn't completely make sense either because the Normans didn't take over Ireland, but okay, that's besides the point. Or at least I don't think they did. I guess if I'm wrong, you guys can roast me in the comments on that factual point if I'm incorrect on that. But first, let's kind of state what the argument is, and then I'll go through multiple primary sources refuting that. And what's kind of interesting about this argument, to me at least, is it's really reminiscent of the Low Church Protestants who make a similar claim regarding Constantine. So they'll say, oh, well, the Catholic Church didn't exist until Constantine at the Council of Nicaea. And you'll see various Orthodox that'll make other arguments like, oh, well, the Catholic Church didn't exist until Charlemagne. Charlemagne's the big bad. He spread Papism to the Normans, and the Normans obviously eventually spread Papism to England. So it's the exact same train of thought. It's this, 14th dimensional underwater hungry hippos theory, conspiracy of one person in history being the sort of trigger point which leads to the creation of the Catholic Church, rather than just accepting the obvious reality that it is the Catholic Church that is the true and original church. So let's first start talking about the argument. So here's an example on Twitter that I found. I just searched, Orthodox England. So here's an individual just saying that Saint Edward, so Edward the Confessor, would have been the king, I believe, directly prior to 1066. It was his death that prompted these various wars over who should be king of England, which prompted William the Conqueror to eventually conquer England. So it says he was a champion of the Orthodox faith. So we will kind of be somewhat indirectly testing that claim, because if England prior to St. Edward did not hold to the Orthodox faith, it's very likely that instead Edward was actually a champion of the Catholic faith rather than the Orthodox one. Now the next one here is the one that actually kind of prompted me to make this video. In fact, you can see me tagging Alan Ruhl here, which caused him to make his video. And it's essentially, this girl who's Cat, so Ortho Girl Cat. She says, did you know the British Isles were Orthodox Catholic? If you look at the lives of their saints and spiritual practice, it's very clear, it's all very similar to the saints of the East. So she's saying that not only was their faith Catholic, but their spiritual practice was similar to that of the East. And then she says, in fact, the Great Schism didn't impact the churches here until the Norman invasion of 1066. And that's just a weird claim. But anyway, the bishops were replaced and the church was brought in line with Rome, which he had been out of communion with at the time of the Great Schism. So, the bishops were replaced. It imposed this new faith. It imposed the Catholic faith, whereas before all the bishops were Orthodox. And then she, posts a link to this book here. Now, before we get into this book that we linked, I kind of want to get into her toll house claim really quick. So I kind of went through the comments, and I don't remember exactly where it was, but she posted a quote, and I was able to track it down because it was just posted verbatim from an Orthodox website that talks about toll houses. But it's an excerpt from the Life of St. Columba, and it is this chapter here, chapter 13. So they're claiming this teaches toll houses. I guess I'll just read it. Okay. So, and I guess I don't have this one in the description, but I should add it on there. So it says this. At another time, the venerable man, when he was living in Iona, roused by some sudden impulse in getting the brethren together by the sound of the bell. Now, he says, let us help by prayer the monks and the abbot of Comgel, drowning at this hour in the lock of the Calf, Belfast lock. For behold, at this moment they were warring in the air against hostile powers, trying to snatch away the soul of a stranger who was drowning along with them. Then, after tearful and earnest prayer, quickly rising before the altar among the brethren who are also prostrate in prayer, he says with joyful countenance, give thanks to Christ, for now the holy angels have met these holy souls and have delivered that stranger guest, triumphantly rescued him from the warring demons. So their argument here, so for those who are unfamiliar, the Orthodox doctrine, and I don't even know if it's fair to call it a doctrine, it'd be more like accurate, I think, to say a theory, because it is somewhat disputed in Orthodox circles whether or not toll houses exist. You'll find some that claim it's of Gnostic origin. But the claim here with this quote is that they're saying, oh, look, you have these demons and angels fighting each other over the souls of these dead people. And in the Orthodox doctrine of toll houses is after you die, I believe it's 40 days before you actually get to go to heaven. And you have angels escorting you up, and you have to go through all these toll houses, these checkpoints. And I guess if you don't have the adequate build, you fail your speech check and you get dragged down. It's a very odd way of putting it, because it sort of implies that after death, things can still occur that can cause you to go up or down, rather than under the Catholic view where the particular judgment's immediate. Now this I don't think is actually a very good proof text for their position, because it seems as though speaking in the present tense, drowning, at least in this English translation, so whoever translated this is thinking this present tense, so it's not really clear if these people are dead yet. And Catholics don't reject that there is spiritual warfare, that demons and angels do fight each other, that that demons exist in this realm and they're trying to tempt us and drag us down, and that angels, including our guardian angels, fight back against them. That is also part of Catholic teaching. So I actually don't think that this is a very clear reference to toll houses at all, and see no reason why I would read this not just merely supporting the existence of spiritual warfare. And why? Because again, toll houses has this whole thing, 40 days, it has the specific nature. This doesn't get you anywhere near that. And in fact, I decided to pull up the Latin, and I'm not a great Latinist, but the word here doesn't seem to imply that the people, demersis, doesn't seem to imply either that the people are currently drowned and dead. So overall, I consider this a very weak proof text for her position that the spiritual praxis of the English before 1066 was Orthodox. So I don't consider that argument compelling. Now, she also quoted, and I'll just close these tabs here, she also quoted this book, which is, I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but it's The Fall of Orthodox England. I read parts of it for this book. I read the foreword. I read most of this section. I read parts of this section as well, because I'm a fan of Edward the Confessor. And there's just so many factual errors. Like, honestly, maybe I should do a stream at some point just refuting this book, because I was actually... I was pulling my hair out reading this. But I did make a little document here with a couple quotes that I want to specifically respond to kind of give a framework as to, what we're looking out for and what we're trying to refute in this video. Because obviously this is probably the most systematic treatment of the Orthodox argument, that prior to 1066, England was not Catholic. It was either some form of Protestant or, in this case, Orthodox. So it has a couple interesting quotes here. So he says, the ancient Celtic churches of the British Isles never had much to do with Rome. Never had much. I mean, that's a pretty strong claim. Never had much to do with Rome. I mean, as we're going to show throughout this video, Rome founded the church in England, and at every single point in its development, the Roman See, the Apostolic See, the Pope of Rome, the Roman Pontiff, had his hands on England and was directly answering questions, was hearing appeals, was, instituting disciplinary matters, was giving advice, was appointing bishops, was sending missionaries. The fact is, at the very least, even if you wanted to toss out all the papal claims that we're going to go through and, cope around it and say, oh, that's not Vatican I, whatever, fine. The fact is, Rome was very clearly the spiritual center of England and the development of the English church. In the same way you can say today, for example, that maybe Mount Athos is the spiritual center of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And because no one would say that the Eastern Orthodox Church is going to develop in a manner totally foreign to Mount Athos, and therefore it would follow that England would not develop in a manner totally foreign to the thought system at Rome. So this claim is going to be very clearly debunked, and I don't think anyone who's actually read the primary source work could actually seriously come to this conclusion if they were being honest with themselves. So this next quote is also interesting. So it does admit there's a certain Romanity to the English church, but it's different from the current Catholic view, which is centered around the Bishop of Rome. It says, the Romanity to which the English were so devoted was not the Franco-Latin Roman Catholicism of the Middle Ages. And this is like a weird Franco-Latin, he's just putting words in there, I guess. The Franco-Latin Roman Catholicism of the later Middle Ages. Rather, it was the Greco-Roman Romanitas of Orthodox Catholicism. Okay. And the spiritual and political capital of the Romanitas until the middle of the 15th century was not Old Rome in Italy, but New Rome of Constantinople. Well, what does this mean? Well, I would say he's saying, look, if they're not following this Roman Catholicism of the French, because he's obviously trying to blame it all on Charlemagne, because, again, Charlemagne is the one who invented Catholicism in the same way that, Constantine did it if you're Baptist, so they just shifted a couple hundred years later. So in the same way that Rome is not the center here, they're instead following what he calls the Greco-Roman, Orthodox Catholic view, which is that the political and spiritual center is Constantinople. So he's making a claim that the spiritual capital of England was Constantinople. And when we go through the original sources, you'll see that's obviously ridiculous. Rome and the Apostolic See, not Constantinople and the Ecumenical Patriarch, is what is mentioned time and time again. So here's another quote. It is, "We may tentatively point to the murder of King Edward the Martyr in 979 as the beginning of the end in Orthodox England." Now, I really want you guys to keep in mind this 979 here, because every single source we're going to cite, every single one, literally everything I'm going to be quoting here is from before 979. I will not quote a single source after 979. I'm going to do my best not to quote any scholars. I'm going to do my best not to quote any apologists. We're going to stick to the original source work here and show that prior to 979, prior to 1066, and obviously 979, England was not Orthodox. It actually held to the Catholic faith. In fact, the latest source that we're going to cite is the Regularis Concordia, which was penned and approved in 973, okay? So everything we're going to be talking about is before this date and well before 1066, the Norman invasion. Now, before we get into the specific sources, I just want to give a background as to some of what these sources are and who wrote them. So the first one is going to be by the Saint Venerable Bede. He wrote his very famous book, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. I am going to be using the Penguin version. So this is the only source that I am using throughout this entire video that's not free online. Now, when we read these original sources, I beg you all to actually go out and try to pick up a copy yourself and read them. This book is cheap. It's $10. And, regardless of whether it's this channel, whether you're a fan of Scholastic Answers or Pine Sap, Michael Lofton, Eric Ibarra, it doesn't matter. All these guys quote primary sources, and you guys will learn a ton if you actually just follow the sources we cite and read them yourselves. Because a theology diet purely of YouTube isn't going to get you super far. It's really reading original sources that you'll start to develop your own framework and your own, kind of hermeneutical system, so that when an Orthodox or a Protestant or even an atheist tosses an argument your way, you now have a framework to respond to that argument yourself. So I highly recommend to read these sources, and not only for those reasons, but because I'm not going to go through every single pro-Catholic argument in Bede. I'm not going to go through every single pro-Catholic argument in Asser's work, and I'm not really even going to go super deep into the Regularis Concordia as well. So the fact is, I highly recommend that you actually at least skim various parts of these sources that interest you and go out and get copies of them. And the rest of them, other than Bede, are free, and they're linked in the description. So again, back to Bede, Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Bede's an amazing saint. He's actually called the Venerable because, from what I understand it, during his life, he was called Venerable because of his holy sanctity. And they said, well, we can't call you saint because you aren't dead and you aren't canonized yet, so we're going to call you Venerable. So this is a really learned, well-read individual. His ecclesiastical history kind of began the whole historical movement in England, so it's one of the first sources we have to this period. And it gives you really good insight as to what the English Church's theology was in the 8th century or so. So at the very end of the patristic period and the very beginning of the early medieval period. So this is a source that should be relevant to Catholics, Orthodox, as well as our Anglo-Catholics and Anglicans brothers as well. And even Protestants. This is a book I actually think every English-speaking Christian should read, even if you're a non-denominational, because, this is one of the first ecclesiastical histories written. I think it actually was the first ecclesiastical history written by an Englishman, by an Anglo-Saxon. So this is part of all of our patrimonies, and it's important to read it. Latin, Eastern, whatever your rite is. If you're an English-speaking Christian, you got to read this book. So the next source we're going to go through is Life of St. Wilfred. Now, Life of St. Wilfred was actually, I believe, written slightly before Bede, and in fact it was one of Bede's sources, but it was written by a man named Stephen of Ripon, also known as Edius Stephanus. Stephen of Ripon was not a saint. but he was a clergy member. And it was also another great primary source from the era as to what clergy members, in this time period would have believed. So again, this is the 700s, so 300 years prior to the Norman invasion. Great source. We're going to get into that. Now we're also going to get into Asser, who was a Welsh monk, and in his book, The Life of King Alfred. So this book's going to be a little later. I believe he died in 909, so we're getting kind of close to the end of the period here, but we're still over 100 years before 1066. So we're going to see some really interesting stuff from Alfred as to, what the English church believed regarding the papacy and other stuff. And then finally, we're going to get into the Regularis Concordia. We're not going to get too much into this because I don't want this to be an 18-hour stream, but it was written in 973 and is one of the few primary sources that gets into what the liturgy in England prior to 1066 would have looked like. So with all that said, I think it's time to start actually digging into the primary sources here. Let me grab my phone because I have a couple notes because I don't want to miss anything here, just to make sure I don't lose anything. But okay, looks like I said everything I wanted to say in the intro, so that's good. I'll just put my phone away. So yeah, let's go through Venerable Bede first. And the reason is just because, Venerable Bede is definitely one of my favorite church fathers, and I just think you can learn, kind of a lot. So let's start here, Book 1, Chapter 4. This is just scans I took of my book. You can also see my disgusting handwriting here. So on page 49, I'm also going to follow along in my paper book here, just because if I have to read a long section, it'll be, I think, maybe a little easier to read for me on the paper. But, so this first page here, page 49 of this Penguin edition, you can see here that is basically just talking about how a British king, wrote to the Pope and asked to be made Christian. So I'm not going to make a huge theological point here as to this proves Vatican I, whatever, this proves Catholicism, but it is just going to show that the kings of England are clearly interacting with the popes of Rome, and that they see that the Pope of Rome is the one who they need to write to in order to actually get someone to be sent there in order to get baptized. Now, this could be simply explained by the fact that Rome is the closest see to them. Sure, I'll concede that, fine. I'm not trying to make a huge point about this section, but it does directly refute the claim that the ancient Celtic churches never had much to do with Rome, because it's Rome who they're writing to fix their problem and get baptized. So that's the first kind of interesting tidbit we see in Venerable Bede. So now we can go to Book 1, Chapters 23, I believe it is. And again, very simple, nothing super complicated here. Basically, we're just going to be pointing out how Gregory was inspired by God to send his servant Augustine with several other God-fearing monks to preach the word of God to the English nation. So again, am I going to make a huge theological point about this? Does this prove Vatican I? No. But what it does prove is that Rome is the one who initiated the creation of the English church, that Rome was integral to its formation, and that it would be very unlikely, if Rome was this important to its foundation, that it would stray far from what the Roman church was teaching at any given time. I mean, that you would definitely have the burden of proof if you're going to say, okay, Rome started this church, Rome is intervening in this church, but now they're totally believing in something else. You're going to have to actually provide the evidence for that claim. So basically, all I'm going to point out here is that Rome established the Church of England. Their destinies, in a certain sense, were intertwined from early on, and that Rome could be seen, in a certain sense, as the spiritual center of the English Church. And then here it has a little quote from Gregory here. I'm not exactly sure if it's relevant to our discussion, but I just like that he's, servants of God is one of my favorite titles of the Pope. I think it really aligns well with the Gospel of Luke. I think that's Luke chapter 22. And I think that's actually one of my favorite, proof texts of the papacy as well. So let's go to the next section here. So here we go. We're going to start with page, I believe that's 77. So what's really interesting about this is basically Augustine has been created bishop, and he's now writing to Pope Gregory. He's kind of updating him as to what he's done, what he's achieved, and he has some questions because he's establishing a new church in a faraway land, and he needs to write to the bishop, his authority, the Bishop of Rome, and he has a couple questions about doctrinal stuff. So again, I think this clearly points out, it refutes the claim from the book that, Constantinople is the spiritual head because he's writing to Rome. It rejects the idea that these old churches never had much to do with Rome because he's writing to Rome. And obviously, this is happening well before 976. So he's writing to Rome and asking questions, and the Pope answers. And you actually get some really interesting stuff here. So in page 78, we see this. Pope Gregory replies, Holy Scripture, with which you are certainly well acquainted, offers us guidance in this matter, and in particular the letters of blessed Paul to Timothy, in which he carefully instructs him on a bishop's duties in the house of God. But it is the custom of the Apostolic See to instruct all newly consecrated bishops that all money received is allocated under one of four heads. And then he kind of explains where, the money, that you give to the church and stuff is supposed to be sent out. But what I just find interesting here is that he says it's the custom of the Apostolic See to instruct all newly consecrated bishops. Okay? So the Apostolic See clearly sees itself as having some sort of authority, whether you think it's canonical, man-made, a historical accident, de jure divino, whatever. He sees himself as being in a certain specific pastoral role over other bishops. So that's just an interesting point. And then he goes on. So in this section here, it says, if there are any clerics who have not received sacred orders and who cannot accept a life of continence, let them marry and receive their stipends outside of the common fund. So this is actually a really interesting point as well, because it's clearly showing that in England there's a very strong monastic tendency among the clergy, and that clerical celibacy is the norm. So that actually is somewhat different from the Byzantine tradition of married priests. I'm not arguing against that tradition. I think that's a venerable tradition among the Easterns that they can keep if they so wish. But this is just pointing to show out that, for any clerics who have not yet been ordained, so they're still probably in formation of some form, but they cannot accept continence, because clearly that is the discipline that is common in the West as well as common in England, then you should let them marry, and basically, they won't be priests anymore. So that's clearly a discipline. I mean, because again, remember, Orthodox Cat, or whatever her name was claiming that the spiritual praxis of England and the East was similar, yet here we have a claim that clerical celibacy is the norm. That's much more in line, I think, with the Western view and the Catholic view, isn't it? And then we have another interesting point that I want to read, because he's asking about different customs in the churches, so different disciplines, different liturgies even. And this is a point that's often used against Catholics, because they'll say, oh, well, you guys have Eastern rites, you guys have all the rites, which in my opinion is actually an argument for the Catholic Church. But they'll say, oh, you have all these rites, so you guys have a fake unity. You guys have a fake unity. You're too divergent. There's no actual unity there. But we see here Pope Gregory replying to Augustine's questions as to why do the customs vary. And in fact, is very similar. So Augustine says, why do the customs vary in the churches? Why, for instance, does the method of saying Mass differ in the Holy Roman Church and the churches of Gaul? And the Pope replies, my brother, you are familiar with the usage of the Roman Church. Now let's stop right there. I think there's an important point here. And that is, Augustine himself would have been practicing the Roman liturgy and saying Mass, okay? Mass comes from the word mise, okay? So he's clearly following the Roman usage. So the liturgy in Rome in England before 1066 would have been the Roman rite. Okay? The first Masses said by Augustine when establishing the church would have been the Roman rite, because he himself was a member of the Roman rite. But the Pope continues, in which you were brought up. But if you have found customs, whether in the Church of Rome or of Gaul or of any other that may be more acceptable to God, I wish you to make careful selection of them and teach the Church of the English, which is still young in the faith, whatever you have been able to learn with profit from the various churches. For things should not be loved for the sake of places, but for the sake of good things. Therefore, select from each of the churches whatever things are devout, religious, and right. And when you have bound them, as it were, into a sheaf, let the minds of the English grow accustomed to it. So what are we going to take from this? First, I think it's important to note that liturgical diversity was something celebrated as good in the early church. And the Catholic Church is the only church today which still actually has all of the rites. Obviously, the Western rites have been condensed somewhat, as anyone who's familiar with the history is aware. But the fact is, the Catholic Church has by far the most liturgical diversity of any church community. And I can't, maybe I'm wrong, but I can't think of a church community that's going to have, a high church community that would have more liturgical diversity. So we meet this. The Eastern Orthodox don't, because they really have the Byzantine Rite, and you have like a couple Western Rite churches here and there. I live in Colorado, so I'm actually close to a lot of the Western Rite churches, but again, the diversity they have is nowhere near the level of ours. So that's one important point. Second important point, though, is that clearly, so not only was Augustine the first liturgies that Augustine's doing going to be basically just the pure Roman Rite, but he seems to be asking about Gaul specifically. So any additions that are going to differ from the Roman Rite aren't going to be Byzantine additions. There's not going to be any iconostasis or anything induced in England, but it's going to be from the Church in Gaul. So the liturgy is going to be very, very Western, and by extension, probably the spirituality as well, because of how important the liturgy is to the spirituality. So this is also a point, in my opinion, in favor of the early church in England being Catholic. But let's keep going, because it's going to get even more. So let's see. On page 84, I'm not really going to get into that. Okay, page 98. So page 98 is a really interesting one. In fact, Alan Ruhl actually posted this quote on Twitter, I think this morning, or maybe earlier this afternoon. So poaching my content a little bit. No, I'm just kidding though. But it's on the death of Pope Gregory, and let's just read what Venerable Bede has to say. About this time in the year of our Lord 605, having ruled the Apostolic Roman Church most illustriously for 13 years and 6 months and 10 days, the blessed Pope Gregory died and was taken up to his eternal home in heaven. And it is fitting that he should receive fuller mention in this history, since it was through his zeal that our English nation was brought away from the bondage of Satan to the faith of Christ, and may rightly term him our own apostle. For during his pontificate, while he exercised supreme authority over all the churches of Christendom that have long since been converted, he transformed our still idolatrous nation into a church of Christ. Okay, so what does this mean? I think it means what it says. Pope Gregory had supreme authority over all the churches in Christendom. It means what it says. I'm not going to add any more commentary. You can interpret that however you will. If you could find an Orthodox person who's willing to say that the popes exercise supreme authority over all the churches in Christendom, or a Protestant who's willing to say that, I'd be impressed. I can think of plenty of Catholics who would say that, though. Okay, so let's move on here. Let's see. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Bishop Honorius of Canterbury receiving the pallium from Pope Honorius. I think it's the famous Pope Honorius as well that we all debate about. And I'm not going to go into and read this entire section. Again, you can pause the screen and read it yourself, or you can purchase a copy of Venerable Bede if you want to read this chapter. But I think what's kind of interesting here is that Bede just kind of implants a papal claim in here. And it's just straight there. It's just a quote from Honorius. Let's see. In response to your request, and that of our sons of your kings, we hereby, in the name of blessed Peter, Prince of the Apostles, grant that whenever God's mercy shall summon either of you to himself, the survivor shall have authority to appoint a bishop in his place. As proof of this authority, we have sent each of your lordships the pallium to wear at such a consecration, so that by our permission and direction you may perform it in a manner acceptable to God. Okay, so what do we get from this? First, Pope Honorius, the Bishop of Rome, is clearly claiming authority in the name of blessed Peter, the Prince of the Apostles. He's making a very clear, in my opinion, de jure divino claim to his primacy. He's not saying that his authority comes from the canons. He's not saying his authority comes from a council. He's not saying his authority comes from an imperial edict. He's not saying his primacy comes from Peter dying at Rome, Paul dying at Rome, martyrs, or the general orthodoxy of the Roman See. It is coming from blessed Peter himself. Okay, so that's one point. The second point is that he's clearly granting the pallium to the bishop. So he's basically stating that your authority, so by our permission and direction, you may perform it in a manner acceptable to God. He is granting the authority to the Bishop of England. He is saying your authority is granted by me, and hopefully you can follow it and be a good bishop. So it's kind of similar to the Catholic argument today of all bishops may have the keys in some sense, but they're communicated through the Pope, they're communicated through Peter. That's what we're seeing here. So Bede contains, in my opinion, a relatively moderately strong papal claim by Pope Honorius that would have occurred in the 600s, 400 years prior to 1066, and Venerable Bede doesn't seem to have any problem including this in his history, and he doesn't see it as problematic. Here's another one. So it's Pope Honorius and later Pope John. So they're writing about the controversy, the Easter controversy that happened in England, as well as the Pelagian heresy. So one of the things that's important to note about this period of English history is that there was a debate, as there was also a debate in Victor's time, as to the date of Easter. And I guess there's also a debate today on the date of Easter, isn't there? But essentially, you have the church following one practice, the practice that was instituted at Nicaea, as well as what Victor wanted. And then you had the practice of the Irish, who had their own way of calculating it. So you have here John IV, who, according to Bede, quote, sent them authoritative and learned letters to correct this error. Okay, so he's sending them an authoritative letter. So clearly John has some form of authority over the Church of England. That doesn't sound very Orthodox to me. And then we go on. So when it comes to refuting the sin of Pelagianism, it says, quote, all other men are born in original sin and bear unmistakable evidence of Adam's fall even when they are innocent of actual sin. Now, the reason I'm bringing this one up specifically is you find a lot of Orthodox, especially contemporary ones, who are influenced by Romanides. So Romanides is a contemporary, I believe, 20th century Orthodox scholar. He teaches things like, oh, the Orthodox Church doesn't believe in original sin and all that other stuff. Now, learned Orthodox, they will accept original sin because they're aware that it's in their tradition. But the fact is, a lot of them don't. And I get the impression that the people who make the argument that England was Orthodox prior to 1066 would also be reticent to accept original sin into their praxis or into their belief system. So the fact is, if they think that England was Orthodox and they themselves think that original sin is not Orthodox, here you have Venerable Bede receiving a letter from a pope as part of his patrimony. He's saying this is part of the English tradition here, that is stating original sin is something that we are actually born of. Now you might say, well, Alexander. He says, even when they're innocent of actual sin, doesn't that refute your position? Well, not really. Because as I noted here, that's basically entirely in accord with the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 404, which, as we read, describes original sin as a sin only in an analogical sense. It is a sin contracted and not committed. It is a state and not an act. So, very clearly, the Church of England in the, let's see what year it was. It would have been the 600s, okay? So 400 years prior to the invasion of England would have held to the Catholic view of original sin. Okay. And by the way, he even seems to quote the psalmist here. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin my mother did conceive me. I think that's Psalm 50 or 51. I think it varies as well depending on if you're using a Vulgate translation or not. But anyway, boom. So we have a clear example of a Catholic doctrine being taught in England. So this section, I'm going to read it in depth, I think, because it's about the Irish controversy over the date of Easter. Also, I'm going to see if there's any comments, just if anyone's saying I'm too quiet or speaking too fast or something. Oh, it's Duong. Hey, Duong. Okay. So chapter 25, he is discussing the Irish controversy over the date of Easter. So I think I'm just going to read this in full. Maybe that's the way to do it. It's kind of long. I don't know if I should read all of it. Maybe I should try to summarize it. You know what? Let's just see if I can summarize parts of it. So, okay, so one of the problems here is that there was a confusion because you had some parts of the Irish church and they'd be following the Irish custom, and you had other parts that were following the Roman custom. And this was exacerbated when the Queen and the King herself had different traditions on this practice. So you'd be celebrating Easter twice, and that was seen as inappropriate here. So, Wilfred, and we'll get into Wilfred in a bit. Wilfred was a proponent of the Roman practice. And Wilfred had gone to Rome, and his position is that the Roman position was correct. So, obviously, he was going to promote the position that was consistent in the rest of the church, because the rest of the church was on the same schedule here. Let's go on a bit. I just have a funny mark here because one of the quotes here describes the Irishmen as obstinate and stupid. I love these old documents. Let's see. Okay. So let's just get to this part in the Synod of Whitby where, and I'm going to read this in full. So, you have the kind of back and forth going. You have this guy Coleman, he's the Irish bishop, making the claim that the Irish position is the correct one. And then you have Wilfred reply, and it's really interesting to see what Wilfred uses to back up his position, why Wilfred is so confident that he is correct. So he says this: It is well established that Anatolius was a most holy, learned, and praiseworthy man, answered Wilfred. And Anatolius is, that's kind of the person that Coleman's citing to back up his position. But how can you claim his authority when you do not follow his directions? For he followed the correct rule about Easter, and he observed a cycle of 19 years, but either you do not know of this general custom of the Christian church, or else you ignore it. He calculated the 14th day of the moon of Easter according to the Egyptian method, counting it on the evening as to the 15th day. Similarly, he assigned the 20th to Easter Sunday, similarly after sunset as the 21st day. But it appears to you that you do not realize this distinction, since you sometimes keep Easter before full moon, that is, on the 13th day. And with regard to your father Columba and his followers, whose holiness you claim to imitate and whose rules and customs you claim to have been supported by heavenly signs, I can only say that when many shall say to our Lord at the day of judgment, have we not prophesied in thy name and cast out devils, and done many wonderful works, the Lord will reply, I never knew you. So he just kind of goes on. And then here's a little bit, because he's going to start saying, here's why you're wrong 100%. But you and your colleagues are most certainly guilty of sin if you reject the decrees of the Apostolic See. I'm going to just read that again, because I don't think this even needs exegesis. It just means what it says. You and your colleagues are most guilty of sin if you reject the decrees of the Apostolic See. And for those of you who don't know, Apostolic See is referring to Rome. Indeed, of the universal church, which are confirmed by Holy Writ. What's happening here, okay? He is equating Rome with the universal church. That's pretty interesting, and that's pretty Catholic, if you ask me. Let's continue. For although your fathers were holy men, do you imagine that they, a few men in the corner of a remote island, are to be preferred before the universal church of Christ throughout the world? Even if your Columba, or, may I say, ours also, if he was a servant of Christ, was a saint potent in miracles. Let's see. And then he says, can he take precedence before the most blessed prince of the apostles, whom the Lord said, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Okay? So he is equating Rome with the universal church, and he is now exegeting Matthew 16, one of these Petrine texts, in relation to the Apostolic See and the universal church. All of these concepts are intertwined. That is Catholic ecclesiology right there in the English church hundreds of years before the schism, as recorded by St. Venerable Bede in the 8th century. Now, when Wilfred ended his speech, the king then asked, is it true, Coleman, that these words were spoken to Peter by our Lord? And he answered, it is true, your majesty. And the king said, can you show a similar authority was given to your Columba? Okay, because think about it like this. Columba, he's asking about a specific person. Peter, specific person, okay? So if Peter, and then obviously they're referencing the Apostolic See of Rome. So it is Rome that has inherited this authority of Peter. Columba hasn't. That's Catholic ecclesiology, guys. And then he says, no, replied Coleman. Do you both agree, the king continued, that these words were indisputably addressed to Peter in the first place, and that our Lord gave him the keys to the kingdom of heaven? So now you have the king at this synod saying, is it true that Peter received the keys of the kingdom of heaven individually himself? And they say this. Both answered, we do. And at this the king concluded, then I tell you, Peter is the guardian of the gates of the kingdom of heaven, and I shall not contradict him. I shall obey his commands in everything to the best of my knowledge and ability. Otherwise, when I come to the gates of heaven, there will be no one way to open them, because he who holds the keys turns away. So this, in my opinion, is also a very clear statement at the Synod of Whitby in favor of Roman primacy in England. So the opposite of the English claim that the Bishop of Rome hath no jurisdiction, the Bishop of Rome clearly does have jurisdiction. So let's go on. Let's see what else we have here. Okay. Here's just another one. Fully aware that the Roman Church was the Catholic and Apostolic Church. Again, we see some sort of equivalency being drawn up between the Church Universal and the Bishop of Rome. That's a pretty strong argument against the claim that the church prior to 1066 was not Catholic. Let's continue. So we get to go on. So now we're going to look at a letter from Pope Vitalin to King Oswy. Now this is really, Vitalian. Now this is important because, again, Bede is just a historian. He's recording stuff, but he is recording a papal claim in his history of England. And he's grafting this on because he's saying this is relevant to England. This is our church history. He's not repudiating it. He's putting stuff in there that he thinks the English church needs to preserve. So what do we have here? So it says, let's see. So he thinks that, okay, let's look at this. So this is the Pope writing to the king. It must therefore be the task of your majesty, as a living member of Christ, always to observe the holy precepts of the Prince of the Apostles, both in keeping Easter and in everything transmitted to us by the holy apostles Peter and Paul, who, as the heavenly bodies in light of the world, give daily their teachings to the hearts of all believers. Okay, what are we getting out of this? He is stating that the king needs to follow the precepts of the Prince of the Apostles. And where are the precepts of the Prince of the Apostles? Where are those? He says they were transmitted to us, that is the bishops of Rome, by Peter and Paul. Okay? So what you have here is he's saying you need to follow everything that Peter and Paul taught. And where do you know what where is what Peter and Paul taught? Is with Rome. It's with the bishops of Rome. That's basically the Catholic claim. That's Catholic ecclesiology right there. And if you're listening, King Charles, you got to listen to Pope Francis, become Catholic, end your schism. Okay, so the Pope continues on. And I'm not going to read this whole bit, but I'm just going to read this section here. But again, it's all on screen, so you can't claim that I'm taking this out of context. It says, we gratefully acknowledge the gift sent to your highness, to the blessed Prince of the Apostles, in tribute to his immortal memory, and pray for your safety together with the Christian clergy. Well, what does this mean? The king obviously sent gifts of some form to the Pope. And what did the Pope say in reply? He is recognizing these gifts as gifts to the blessed Prince of the Apostles, that is Peter. So the Pope is seeing himself, in some sense, as Peter. He's saying, I am Peter. I am Peter's successor. I have the prerogatives of Peter. The Pope is, in some sense, an inheritor of the Petrine prerogatives. That, again, is Catholic ecclesiology, not Orthodox ecclesiology. So let's see. We're going to go on. Here's like a little bit here. It's just Archbishop Theodore. So Archbishop Theodore was, I believe, a Greek himself. And I've actually been reading a lot about Theodore recently because he's the author of these penitential works that actually caused problems in the Western Church later on. But I'm not going to get into that right now. In this council and synod specifically, he was entirely Orthodox. And just from this little opening bit here, he's, kind of writing here about how, the authority, let's see. No, that's not what I wanted to get at. Yes, this is what I wanted to get into. So I wanted to get into chapter 10 here. So it's on marriages. And as you guys know, or may or may not know, but I'm working on a really long, comprehensive video on this. And in the same way Duong's writing a book on this, I'm very strongly considering writing a book on this as well. As to marital indissolubility, that is the prohibition on remarriage after divorce in the early church. And I go through every single church father that writes about this through Justinian. In fact, I have a lot of research now that goes well past Justinian and goes basically up to the Great Schism. But anyway, right here we're going to talk about marital indissolubility. And let's just see how the Synod of Hertford, which is imposing its discipline on England, how the English church viewed remarriage after divorce. It says this, chapter 10, on marriages, quote, that lawful wedlock alone is permissible, incest is forbidden, and no man may leave his wife except as the gospel provides for fornication. And if a man puts away his wife, who is joined to him in lawful marriage, he may not take another if he wishes to be a good Christian. He must either remain as he is or be reconciled with his wife. That basically means what it says. It is impossible to divorce your wife, like you shouldn't divorce your wife, unless she cheats on you. But she's still your lawful wife, and if you can't be reconciled, you must remain as you are. And if you marry someone else, you are not a good Christian. That's the Catholic position. And the way that the Church of England at this point in time is clearly interpreting Matthew 19 and the Pornea clause, which is, the famous excepted be for fornication clause of Matthew 19:9, is clearly applying that to divorce, saying that allows divorce, but it doesn't apply it to the latter half of the verse, which is remarriage, because the other gospel passages prohibit remarriage. There's no exception. So Matthew 19:9 is maybe perhaps allowing divorce in a certain circumstance, or to put it in the words of Catholic canon law today, it would be allowing separation from bed and board, but it would not be allowing remarriage. So let's go on to the next bit. And again, that's fully in line with the Catholic view of marriage. That's not in line with the Orthodox view, which allows for 2 divorces for a total of 3 marriages, or which is, by the way, imposed entirely from Byzantine imperial law. And it's not in accord with any Protestant view as well, because Protestants obviously admit divorce for a whole host of reasons, as well as remarriage for a whole host of reasons. And as far as I'm aware, there's no major Protestant body which allows for, which does not allow for divorce and remarriage. So this again shows that the Catholic faith existed in England. Let's continue on. Now, if Duong is still watching, we're about to get to his favorite part of the video. So we're getting to the Synod of Hatfield, and this is something I quoted in my video a little while back. And it says this: "And we glorify God the Father, who is without beginning, and his only begotten Son, begotten of the Father before all worlds, and the Holy Spirit, ineffably proceeding from the Father and the Son, as proclaimed by all the holy apostles, prophets, and teachers, whom we have already mentioned." For anyone aware, that's the filioque. So that's not the Orthodox faith, that's the Catholic one. The filioque was therefore part of the patrimony of the English Church. It was the Catholic faith, not the Orthodox one. So we can continue. Okay, we're at the end here. So let's just talk about this a little bit here. So it's just talking about how John, the Archcantor of the Apostolic See, is coming to Britain. And he obviously has his authority from the bishop, from the Pope. So that's, why he's explaining why he's there. And then it also says this: "For this reason, Pope Agatho wished to be informed on the state of the church in Britain as well as in other provinces, whether it be free from contamination by heretics." So what does this mean? Again, clearly the Pope is wanting to remain apprised on these areas super far away, super far flung away from his reach. It doesn't necessarily specify what these other provinces are, but again, I think that is probably a loose claim to some sort of jurisdiction. And again, it clearly aligns with the fact that Rome, not Constantinople or anywhere else, was the spiritual center of England. And wherever Rome was going to go in its magisterial teachings, England was likely to follow along as an obedient son, because up to this point, that's what they were doing. So I think that's it for Bede. Let's go into a little bit for the Life of Wilfred here. And let me check my notes really quick to make sure I didn't miss anything on Bede. But I think I got everything I wanted. Okay, looks like I did. Okay. So, let me give a little bit of background, actually, on this. So this is The Life of Wilfred, written by Edius Stephanus. And just to refresh everyone's memory, Edius Stephanus, or Stephen of Ripon, as he's called in modern scholarship, would have been around the same time as Bede, and this specific book would have been written slightly before Bede. It was actually one of Bede's sources. And this is about a man named Wilfred. So Wilfred's actually a saint in both the Catholic and Orthodox churches. And one of the big points in his life was a dispute with a man named, I think it's Ceda. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But anyway, it was over who was the rightful Bishop of York. Because Wilfred was Bishop of York, and, he left. There was politicking with the king. The king removed him, instituted a new bishop. And so that a big point in his life, a big point in his biography, is his appeal to Pope Agatho, to the Bishop of Rome, in order to resolve this dispute. So I think the place I want to start in this work is page 59. And what's really cool about this edition as well that I posted is that it has the English on one page and the Latin on the other. So if you can read Latin or want to go through with it, because I can't read Latin for the most part. Like I basically rely on dictionaries to do so, and I can read Spanish, so that sometimes helps. Sometimes it doesn't really, but this is cool for those of you who can read Latin. So yeah, so let's go to 59 here. So it basically is setting up the appeal and that Wilfred has sent to the Bishop of Rome, and before Agatho has even heard of the appeal, Andrew, who's the Bishop of Ostia. So Ostia is I think it's near Rome, or it's in Rome. So this is an Italian bishop. He had already spoken to Wilfred, and he's going to kind of make the case as to why the Pope should hear Wilfred's appeal. And he says this: the regulation of all the churches rests upon the decisions of your apostolic authority, who fill the place of the blessed Peter, chief of the apostles, to whom Lord Jesus Christ, the creator and redeemer of all men, give the keys for binding and loosing. Okay, and it looks like I have a note here. I wonder what okay. So, what can you get from this? Well, one, the regulation of all the churches rests on the decisions of the apostolic authority. So he's saying that the Bishop of Rome has some sort of authority over all the bishops in the church, over all the churches in the church, and that whenever disputes arrive, it's the Pope who has the right to settle it. Now, why does the Pope have the right to settle it? Is it because the Pope's super Orthodox historically? No. Is it because the Pope had a history of martyrs in the early church? No. Is it because Rome historically was an important city? No. Andrew says it is because, quote, you fill the place of the blessed Peter, chief of the apostles, to whom Lord Jesus Christ, the creator and redeemer of all men, gave the keys for binding and loosing. So one, Peter, in a singular manner, as a singular individual, received the keys for binding and loosing in a manner in which the others didn't. That doesn't deny that the other apostles got the keys for binding and loosing, as we see in Matthew 18, but that Peter simply got it in a unique way. So that's one point. The second point is that Pope Agatho is currently the successor to Peter, the chief of the apostles. Why? And why is he the chief of the apostles? Because Jesus established him as such. So you have a very clear de jure divino claim, okay? And if anyone wants to understand why that's significant in favor of Catholicism over Eastern Orthodoxy or over Protestantism, I highly recommend getting Eric Ibarra's book or watching his recent video on primacy but not supremacy or whatever it was, where he explains the minimal facts case for the papacy and how this is devastating to any ecclesiology that's not Catholic. And then he goes on at the bottom of this, so Andrew continues, Bishop Wilfred, beloved of God, informed his fellow bishops of the merits of his case and forthwith hastened to the Apostolic See, in which he who redeemed the Holy Church by his blood, Christ the Almighty Lord, founded the primacy of the chief priesthood and established the authority of the chief of the apostles. Okay, so what do we have here? It looks like I also have a note here. Yep. So there's a certain chief authority that is bestowed upon the Bishop of Rome, and it is the same authority as that of the chief of the apostles, that is Peter. So again, very clear de jure divino claim. And again, this is Arius Stephanus putting this in his work as something, because again, he's logging, so he's writing a biography for Wilfred, and he's a supporter of Wilfred, and Wilfred's the one who won out. Wilfred is the one who kind of became one of the leading voices in the English church at this time. So this can be seen as not only the opinion of Stephanus, but of the opinion of the Wilfred party, which again was the main party in England, by the time Bede was around. So we're talking, 4 centuries before the invasion of 1066. And he is logging a very clear claim to papal primacy, papal supremacy here, and papal jurisdiction over the Isles of England well before any Norman invasion. And he is logging this as something that is important and something that is good, because Wilfred is good and this supports Wilfred. So this is something that people at the time would be believing in England. So they clearly hold to a Catholic ecclesiology. Let's go on. Page 61 here. So now this is the actual petition of Wilfred himself. And it goes on to say this. I, Wilfred, a humble and unworthy bishop of England, have ordered the goings of my heart by the guidance of God to this, the apostolic eminence, as though a fortress or strong tower. For I confidently expect that, in place whence I know the rules of the sacred canons go forth to all the churches of Christ spread throughout the world. Okay? So he is coming to Rome, and he's going to the place that spreads the faith throughout the whole world. So he's clearly seeing Rome as the focal point of the church throughout the whole world. And then we can go on here. And he says down here, so he's talking about, one of his opponents here, and he says, indeed, I dare not accuse, one of his, the Archbishop Theodore, because Theodore was involved in this too. And he says, I dare not accuse him because he has been dispatched by this apostolic and principal see. So what do we get? 1, Rome is the principal see, okay? So that's at the very least some sort of primacy. And 2, that he's not going to attack Theodore, even though they're both bishops and therefore on equal level, because he was dispatched by Rome. So clearly Rome, since Theodore has some sort of Roman authority that clearly makes it so that he can't just go out of his way and attack him. So Rome somehow adds an extra layer of authority to bishops in England that they wouldn't have beforehand. That, again, aligns very, very well with Catholic ecclesiology. And he closes his appeal with this: "For I am sure that I show absolute compliance of devoted obedience to apostolic laws, to whose justice I have hastened, casting everything else aside with the absolute confidence of heart." So he's basically just saying, I'm going to listen to whatever you say, okay? He actually, something I didn't highlight when I first read this up here, actually, that I'm noticing now. "Then I accept and venerate the decision promulgated by the Apostolic See with all my heart." So again, he is praising the Apostolic See's authority. He is asking the Apostolic See to intervene on his behalf. Why? Because the Apostolic See has greater authority than he has, even though he is a bishop. So clearly this whole Cyprianic ecclesiology that you see Protestants holding, or even some Orthodox holding, that all bishops are exactly equal, while that's true in terms of their ordination, it's not true in terms of their authority over the church. And that's precisely the Catholic argument, and Wilfred is beautifully, in my opinion, setting that forth here. So clearly that goes to show the importance of Rome to the English church well prior to 1066. Papism was not imposed by force. It was accepted as divinely revealed dogma by the English. Now, this also is interesting because it includes Pope Agatho's answer. And this is another claim by Pope Agatho. And those of you who are well versed in the whole papal apologetic stuff know that Pope Agatho is a very strong proponent of papal primacy and supremacy. And he's basically just, praising here Wilfred for procuring the canonical aid of our blessed founder, Peter the Chief Apostle. So a couple things. One, there is a certain degree of canonical aid. So he is canonically doing something. So I guess that goes against the Chieti document. I think Pope Agatho beats the Chieti document. Canonical, and for anyone wondering about that, you can watch my last stream where I review J. Dyer and Pine Sap on that. And he's also identifying himself as Peter the Apostle in some sense. So not only is his aid canonical, but it is from Peter the Chief Apostle. He sees himself as Peter. He's saying, I am Peter. And then he also says down here, the blessed Apostle Peter, whose ministry we fulfill, shall decide by our mouth. Okay? And then he goes on. So the synod, so at this time, and another thing too is one of Ubi Petrus's arguments is always, the Pope is doing it by synod, therefore that debunks papal primacy. But the fact is, even today, the Pope does stuff through his dicasteries, like the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith. So the idea that the Pope can't rule through these intermediary bodies and make these intermediary bodies part of the magisterium is quite ridiculous. The idea this undermines the papal claims is ridiculous. I actually think that Hergenrother in his book Anti-Janus talks about this specifically. But anyway, so here's the synod's answer. This would also be part of the papal magisterium. This would have been headed by Agatho, so it even says that here. They met together with Agatho, and it says this: "We declare by the authority of blessed Peter, the chief of the apostles." So I'm not going to read this. It's in the comments. It's on your screen. Feel free to read it if it interests you. And in fact, this specific document, this is all I'm going to go through here, but this specific document has a ton of other papal proofs in it that if you're interested in this topic or what the English faith was, I highly recommend reading this. Like 10 out of 10. This is free. Unlike the Bede book, you don't have to buy it. Though I should note you can also find other translations of Bede that aren't the Penguin one for free, but that's besides the point. You can read this for free. Read it. Tons of papal proofs in here. Very clearly, in my opinion, you see papal claims. You see England accepting these papal claims. And Wilfred's victory in his controversy fundamentally, in the end, proves papal primacy and the orthodoxy of that. So before we go to the next source, let me check my notes and see if I'm missing anything. And by the way, this is unscripted. I just have a couple of notes in my phone of like pages I want to jump to make sure that I didn't miss anything. I think I hit everything I want to talk about here. All right, we're almost done. So we're going into the Life of Alfred. So the Life of Alfred is a really interesting book. It's really short. You could probably read this in just an hour or less. I think I read it in about an hour, maybe a little less. It might take a little more. It just depends on how fast you read. But this one was one recommended to me by Alan Ruhl, and it's really funny because on page 5, you already get something really interesting. So I'm just going to read it and then we can talk about it. Alfred at Rome. In that same year, King Aethelwulf sent his above-named son Alfred to Rome, with an honorable escort both of nobles and commoners. Pope Leo at the time presided over the Apostolic See, and he anointed as king the aforesaid child. Alfred in the town, and adopting him his son, confirmed him. So what does this show? Like, why am I quoting this? Well, again, for those of you who are familiar with the papal claims, especially in the Middle Ages, there was a certain claim to temporal authority that the Pope had. So it was basically a means of keeping the church separate from the state and saying that there exists a transcendent moral order that God established. We know that he established a church as a guarantor of that moral order and in order to promulgate his doctrines infallibly. If that is the case, the government needs to be set up along the lines of the transcendent moral order, because if it's not, it's going to be doing something immoral. So you can't separate church and state in that sense, and that the church in some level is above the state and actually has temporal authority. Well, what is happening here? Well, we have Leo, according to this, okay, anointing Alfred as king. Now, did he literally make Alfred the successor? Did he literally make Alfred the king and the successor? Because for those of you who don't know, Alfred, I think, was the third born, so he wasn't the firstborn. He became king because of historical accident, but again, this is claiming that he was made anointed king. So did Pope make him the literal successor in that sense? Probably not. Was it an anticipatory coronation? Again, probably not, because he had older brothers. Some historians, because I looked this up to see what the historical take on this is. So this is my one scholar site, so please forgive me. Some historians seem to think that he may have been made some sort of consul or something else. But others say that this didn't happen at all. This is an apocryphal story. And you know what? Maybe it's true. Maybe this did not happen at all. Maybe he was an appointed king or was an appointed consul. But that still, what this still proves is this. Asser himself believed that the Pope had some authority that he could grant to Alfred, who would later become king. And Alfred, who we know did become later king, okay? Asser thinks it's important to add Pope Leo anointing him. He thinks it's important to add this lore. So even if you think this is a fully fabricated event, he thinks that it's important to add this papal lore to Alfred's story, because that adds something to Alfred's claim as king. That adds something to Alfred's life, Alfred the Great's life, okay? So essentially all I'm saying here is that this shows that at least Asser, at least the author of this work, 100 years before the invasion of 1066, believes that the Pope has some level of temporal authority over kings, and that this coronation by Pope Leo was important to Alfred's life story. Okay? That can be aligned with Catholic ecclesiology. I think you're going to have a much harder time aligning Asser's view with Protestant and Orthodox ecclesiologies. So I want to go to another page here. So let's go to page 24. Page 24. 46. So, okay. Basically, it's just talking about how the king of Mercia, after his kingdom fell to the Danes, the pagans, how he fled to Rome. So again, I'm not going to extrapolate too much in this. Like, I'm not going to make some sort of theological claim here. All I am going to say is that the Anglo-Saxons, in this case the Mercians, clearly saw Rome as the spiritual center. So when England was collapsing, where did the king of Mercia go? He didn't go to Constantinople. He didn't go to Antioch. He didn't go to Jerusalem. He didn't go to Alexandria. Well, I guess he wouldn't have gone to some of those because they would have been under Muslim occupation. But the fact is, he went to Rome. He didn't go to Constantinople. He didn't go to Gaul because of the certain connection that they have with the Roman See. Okay? So as I noted earlier, in the same way that Athos can be seen as a spiritual center of contemporary Eastern Orthodox practices, I think that the same can be said with Rome, because they saw Rome founded us. Rome sustains us. Rome intervenes in our affairs. Rome consecrates our bishops. Rome gives our bishops the pallium. There's a very strong connection between Rome and England. And if Rome is moving in this papalist direction, let's just say it was moving in that direction. Now, I think it already was, I think it's always have been to a certain degree. But let's just, for sake of argument, just moving in that direction. It makes sense for England to follow along because they were following the same trajectory, and the English saw themselves as loyal sons of the Roman See. So clearly, regardless of whether or not you think it's correct or not, that is Catholicism, regardless of whether you think Catholicism is correct or not, England at this time was very clearly professing Catholic doctrines. Let's continue. Let's go to page 37. Where's my scroller? There we go. 37. So again, I'm not going to do too much in this. It's basically just saying that he taught his kids Latin and Saxon to read. And in fact, Alfred was very concerned, I believe, like when you read these primary sources, about the lack of Latin education in England, because people could read Saxon but not Latin. Again, I'm not going to extrapolate much, except that very clearly, culturally, they would have been Western. Culturally, they would have been Romanized. There wouldn't be any sort of Byzantinization or whatever, like some people on the internet believe. So let's go to maybe page 38. So the main thing I want to talk about here is that it said that Alfred attended daily Mass. And this is important for a few reasons. One, if you look in the Latin, it's saying Mass, Missae. So clearly this is a Western liturgy, not an Eastern one, and he's doing it daily. So the claim that they're spiritual practices, because it's very common for Eastern churches, is not as common to have daily liturgy. So very clearly the spiritual praxis in England is Western and not Eastern, as was claimed earlier. So let's go to page 60 next, and then I think we're done with this. I'll have to check my notes again. Page 60. Okay. So it's basically just talking about the distribution of revenues that Alfred would get because he wanted to give a certain part of it back to the church. And again, it's basing its practice off the remark of Pope St. Gregory I the Great. And again, I'm not going to make a huge theological point here, except again, they're clearly looking up to Pope Gregory. They're clearly looking up to the Apostolic See. They're clearly looking up to Rome for direction, not anyone else. So again, I think this is a very clear claim that Rome and England's fates were intertwined and that Catholicism wasn't imposed on them by force, okay? They already were Catholic. They already believed in Catholic things. They believed in marital indissolubility. They believed in the papacy. They believed in the filioque. They were following a Western liturgy. They were following a Western spiritual practice. These were not Orthodox. These were Catholics, and they would be Catholics today. So that is it for the first three sources, and now we're going to go into the last one, and I'm not exactly sure how long has this been running. Do Streamlabs tell me? Let's see. Oh, it's been an hour? Okay, let's wrap this up here. So I'm not going to go into any specifics then on the Regularis Concordia. But basically, this was like a monastic agreement, and it's one of the best primary sources if you want to learn about what the liturgy and monastic life and such was like in England prior to 1066 and prior to the Great Schism. Because the primary sources on the English liturgy are really sparse. We've probably gone through most of the references that I can think of in the primary literature that even talks about these things. So the Regularis Concordia is probably the best source for that. And this would have been in the 900s, so we're still 100 years prior to 1066, and we are also a couple years prior to what the author describes as the end of Orthodox England in 979. And there's a couple things that are of note in this. So one, the Regularis mentions private masses. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, I think it was Patriarch Prime on Twitter who was clowning on Catholics for having private masses, where the priest just says Mass alone. This mentions private masses. It mentions daily communion being recommended. That's a very Western idea and practice. It says very early on in the document that the liturgical practices that are to be followed derived from Rome and Gaul. So again, we're going to see spirituality that's much more on Gallican and Roman lines. And finally, if you just read the entire thing, it just sounds very Western in its spirituality. And I guess a final point, if you really want to be pedantic, is every single one of these things that we have gone through today, if you look at the original sources, they were written in Latin. They weren't written in Greek. They weren't written in Slavonic. They're written in Latin. So To summarize everything, 1. English church, in my opinion, believed in the papacy. I believe that if you look through all of the quotes given here today, it would be an inescapable conclusion. If it was just 1 or 2 of these quotes, maybe you could get out of it. But when you look at them as a whole and you allow them to just speak for themselves and allow one quote to interpret the next, I think it is very clear that the English viewed the Apostolic See of Rome and the Roman Pontiff and his prerogatives in a way that is consistent with Catholic ecclesiology, but is not consistent with Anglo-Catholic, Anglican, Protestant, and Orthodox ecclesiologies. 2, they believed in marital indissolubility. Now, I would need to, maybe I'll do an entire stream on England and marital indissolubility. If that's something you want to see, leave a comment. But that is in line with the Catholic view of marriage. It's not in line with the Orthodox one. It's not in line with the Protestant one. They believed in the filioque. Now, the Protestants typically believe in the filioque as well, but the Eastern Orthodox don't. In fact, they consider it, one of the arch heresies, that and the Pope, of course. And it was very clearly taught in the synods as quoted by Bede. So they believed in the filioque. And finally, their overall spirituality was very clearly Western, not Eastern, not anything else. So all of these points lead me to conclude, in sum, that the idea that England was not Catholic prior to 1066 and prior to the schism is one of the worst arguments that Protestants and Orthodox forward. So before I close off, let's just see if there's anyone in the live chat. I don't think there's too many people watching, so I don't expect too many comments, but let's just see here. Oh, Pinesap and Bellarmine are also live. Epic. Well, hopefully everyone can watch each other's stream after. We upload the live streams after, right? So cool. It doesn't look like there's too much to say then as to regards to the comments here. So I'm probably going to end the stream. There's a couple other ideas for streamings I have as well, like if you've heard of Lannoy, the French priest Lannoy. Yes, so Elijah, Theodore of Canterbury in that council did not allow for divorce and remarriage, but he did allow for divorce and remarriage in his penitential works. So he himself was a Greek. He himself likely believed in marital dissolubility, but in that council itself was Orthodox. That council did not teach divorce and remarriage. So thank you for pointing that out. And I think I may have pointed it out earlier, but if I didn't, I forgot. Yeah, so anyway, so there's the French Gallican priest Lannoy, who, he's the one who's famous. Like, he's quoted in that terrible book, and I'm forgetting the name right now. Do I have it on my desk? I don't have it on my desk. But Wesley Chambers is refuting it on his blog, so definitely check that out. But I don't know why it's escaping my mind right now, but I guess that's what happens after an hour of streaming. But will I debate Jay Dyer? I don't know. I mean, if he contacts me with a specific resolution and debate format, maybe. I don't know. But anyway, so Lannoy is the famous Gallican priest who tried to argue that the church fathers did not believe that they taught Peter was the rock. He said that it was his faith. I'm thinking of maybe doing a refutation of that, because it's funny because that list actually isn't even a list of church fathers. It includes lots of scholastics and medievals, and it just uses a really weird hermeneutic. I'm thinking of doing various streams on marital indissolubility, because that's just what I've been reading a lot about. So maybe that would be interesting as well, because I feel as though there's not a lot of good internet YouTube content on marital indissolubility from a Catholic view, especially with thoughts with like looking at the patristics. So maybe I'll do some streams on that. But if you have any other ideas for streams, just let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed what you saw, please leave a like and subscribe. So thank you, and I think I'm going to